on November 5th, 2017, a former Air Force service member walked into this small town, 200, 300 member town in the middle of nowhere between Austin and San Antonio. One stoplight town, walked into this small little house on the prairie church, and within a few seconds shot and killed 26 members and injured 22. All ages, all backgrounds, men, women, children, grandparents, including wiping out almost 5 generations of one family. Absolutely one of the worst things I've ever heard about. It was captured on video, so it's one of the worst things I've ever seen, and one of the worst events I've ever heard described by the people who survived. One of the things we learned and uncovered was there was a 30-year history of the federal government not reporting on a massive scale, not reporting felons to the background check system. And we had dug up various Department of Defense Inspector General reports and various internal warnings that have been going on since the late 80s to the military. And I'm not talking about here or there. I'm talking at 30, 40, 50% failure rates, like just not doing it. And then we focused our discovery on the little base in New Mexico where the shooter resided and where he was convicted. And when we dug into what those offices and the law enforcement agency there had, their failure rate was even higher. And they were just not trained properly. They had some of the officers had no idea they were even required to report it, much less where to report it and how to submit the paperwork. And then we discovered that there were internal checklists that actually had on the checklist 2 boxes. Did you submit this to the FBI? Fingerprints and the conviction. Check yes or no. And they would check them and not submit them. They would told the judge, I said, this is just pencil whipping a checklist. This is what they were doing. And so that's what we learned. So when we dug down from the macro level, from the DOD level, all the way down to what are you doing in that office in New Mexico on that base, we just found a systemic problem that had been going on for a very long time. One of the last things I told the judge in the liability closing was this 30-year negligence where the government just refuses to take accountability has to stop right now, and it has to stop with you. And that made it into his findings. And that's rare. You know this. We all know this as trial lawyers, is we always feel good when we help a family, but we always wonder, is it serving the greater good? And we don't often know, and we don't often get a case where we can say we did something for the greater good. And I was sitting with a federal judge, friend of mine, in the middle of this litigation who wasn't involved in the case. And I just mentioned that fact to him, and he just said, whoa, Jamal, stop right there. He said, if that's all you get done, how many times do you get to know that because of this litigation, an entire country has been made safer? And we talk about community safety all the time. That's what our cases are about. But to be able to verify that on a national scale was important, because it was shocking to me that it wasn't done despite high-level investigations telling the military this has not been done. One thing we didn't do, by the way, which I thought was great, we did not depose any of their government's experts. We went with no depositions, and that really worked out well, because I knew they wouldn't settle. I knew there was nothing to be gained by having a good deposition other than letting them know how I was going to attack them. And because I had the certainty and clarity that they would never offer a dime before the liability trial, it was actually a relatively simple decision. And which I don't say easily, because I really do that on a case-by-case basis. And it turned out to work very well. They had no idea where we're coming from at trial. The stuff that really hit them hard on foreseeability and causation, our plan was every single day of the liability trial, we would drop anywhere between 2 to 4 new documents or facts he had never seen that were eye-popping. Like one of which was we had subpoenaed, or we had requested in production, the security logs for all the bases around the country on a certain time period, because we had learned that this shooter had tried, after he had been kicked out of the military, he had been banned by the entire military from entering any base. So we knew in order for that to happen, they'd have to have a security log, which listed him as a, do not enter guy. And that his ID, if he tried to access a base, his ID would show up on the database. So we requested all that information. So we got back that this guy who had, remember, threatened a mass shooting on base and threatened to kill Air Force members in a mass shooting, had tried not only to re-enter the base they had evicted him from in New Mexico multiple times after he was let out and convicted, but that not long before the shooting, he had tried to enter the San Antonio Air Force Base. And the military in response had heightened his security alert status. So we had this document that they had never seen. Well, they didn't know. There's so many documents, right? They just didn't know this, that their experts had never seen it. And so when we dropped it on the judge while we were cross-examining their experts, the judge just stopped. Every time we talked to him, said, tell me the document number, the exhibit number, tell me the date on that document, and tell me the time on that document.
Yeah.
And I would start asking, and he'd say, Jamal, Mr. Alsaffar, can you stop? Tell me the date on that document. Tell me the exhibit number, the time, of course, which you're just like, obviously this judge is very, very engaged.
Yeah.
And so they had all this information on him. And so their experts hadn't reviewed this, and they didn't know this. And so they were saying there's no foreseeability that this guy would commit this kind of act. He was such a deviant criminal that they knew about. And our theme was, because the government was trying to say, you can't hold us liable. This guy's a monster. And so our theme was, he was a monster, but he was a monster that you knew better than anyone else, even more than his family knew. And you let him loose. And so the fact that the Air Force and the military had actually banned him and protected themselves, the judge actually said this in the middle of the trial. He just said, you guys keep saying that it wasn't foreseeable, but the plaintiffs just showed that not only did you protect everyone on base in New Mexico, you protected the entire Air Force and every base around the country from this guy, but you didn't protect any of us. I mean, that's what he said.
Wow.
You talk about it. I mean, that was our theme. The Air Force cared more about protecting themselves than they did about us. The thought hit me, how do I make him understand what it must have felt like? And, we had all of how we're going to do it. So I measured the church sanctuary and I said, this feels like the size of our courtroom. It's not big at all. It's tiny. And I think this place might be smaller than our actual courtroom. So I had the Texas Ranger, who's one of our main witnesses, measure the courtroom and then measure the church, and they were almost identically the same size.
Wow.
Almost. And if you think about a church and a courtroom, they're very similarly laid out. You have pews in a church, you have pews in a courtroom. The judge sits up high on his pedestal. The pastor sits up high behind their pedestal when they give their sermon. And in this case, the first shots that came through from the outside of the building were aimed at the head of the church, aimed at where the pastor spoke, which is where, frankly, where the judge speaks or where we're standing at our podium. So there was a real pall when we introduced the room to the judge, right? There was a real sense of every time the door opened in the courtroom, people kind of edgy because they were put into that courtroom because where the door was in the church is the same location where the door is in the courtroom to walk in.
Oh, wow.
And so it was very, very much, you need to understand the space as much as we can because we have these bystander claims, right? These children and these people that survived witnessed and went through this trauma. And even those that died some lived several minutes through multiple rounds of him coming in and out. And they were trapped animals. It was, I described it. I said, Your Honor, this wasn't just a war zone. This was a war zone in a close combat, tiny house. That's how you have to think about it. It's not in an open area. It is close combat warfare that these children and these people went through and saw, and they had nowhere to go. They had no escape. So what I did instead was I used the stills right before the shooting. So nothing from the shooting, but literally a second or two before the shooting, I just took stills of the community. It was such a loving space the second before it turned into hell. It was kids running around and laughing. It was children hugging other all of them hugging, parishioners hugging each other and laughing and singing. And so those stills I showed as this is the dramatic turn this thing took. This guy's ahead of the Texas Rangers. He's seen cartel stuff, which is about as bad as it gets. But this scene he walked into, he said was the worst in his life. And when I just asked him, tell me what you saw when you opened the door to the church. Just tell us what you saw. He started crying. Wow. This hard, tough, and he just sobbed. He just couldn't stop. And it was, this is the Texas Ranger, head of the Texas Rangers. And it was really impactful. But for me, when everyone asked me, what do you think the verdict's going to be? I said, I think it's going to be somewhere between 225 and 250. Yeah. And they were like, why? I think we're going to get, and I said, no, because I think that it's really important for the judge to not be anywhere close to an outlier. He's worried about the Fifth Circuit. And if he comes somewhere in that range, there's really nothing they can say about the reasonableness of the verdict. Yeah. I mean, of course, it's a lot of money. Of course, it's one of the largest that I think the government has had to pay. But when you look at what happened and you look at the damage and the evidence we put on, that's really what's key is his findings. You look at the evidence we put on, it's absolutely reasonable. So I think from that perspective, he could have gone, several million per each one, I think, and still totally been within what I think would have been a protected record. But it was, to him, I think it was very important that he got a number that he thought could easily be secured on appeal. And I think he did that.